Hey guys, welcome to our next flip video, kind of introducing this next unit, Unit 5 we're going to be getting in, and this unit's going to cover 1865 to 1914, so just after the Civil War up until World War I. Alright, so a big part of this era is the way the nation transformed. We had just exited the Civil War, and now our nation really starts kind of expanding and transforming and becoming what we know today. And so a couple of the bigger things that happened, you have the Transcontinental Railroad getting completed in 1869, and that let people travel across the country really quickly and really cheaply for the time. So that allowed for more westward expansion, more exploration, things like that. You also had a lot of citizens who started moving west after the Civil War, and as they were doing this, they start settling, and they start forcibly removing Native American tribes, making them go live on reservations and things like that. Part of this is government controlled with the passage of the Dawes Allotment Act. And what the Dawes Act does is it broke up the Native American land, and it effectively reduced the native land base by about 90 million acres. So there was a lot of land that was once Native American that now has been taken from them. And so part of this era is not really a proud history for America in the way we treat the Native Americans. You also have, with this expansion, there's this idea introduced that the frontier is closed. So in 1890, the census releases some data that there's no place in the United States with fewer than 2 people per square mile. And so there's this sense that we're running out of room. And we as a country then start looking to expand. And so we start looking into Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Philippines and Hawaii. And this is where, this era is where we as a country start kind of going into these other places to expand our land holdings. One of the effects of this idea of the frontier closing is there's a romanticism around the Wild West. You have a lot of people, especially in urban cities, New York, Chicago, places like that, where they're starting to get pretty densely packed, who romanticize this idea of living out west in the open frontier and things like that. And so you have a rise in popularity of stories about Kit Carson, this is a picture of a dime novel of Kit Carson, and Billy the Kid and things like that. And there's just this idea that there's this romance idea around the Wild West and the frontier. Also, along with the frontier closing, I mentioned on the slide a couple slides ago, the country starts looking to expand its land holdings, expand our base. And so we start looking at gaining former Spanish possessions. We start looking into Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, things like that. And so what you've got here is an advertisement for Harper's Magazine, just advertising their coverage of the Spanish-American War. But this idea, in this era of us expanding our borders, of gaining more area, is an important concept. It shapes the literature, and it shapes what's going to come in the future. Another huge part of this era is just the sheer growth of the number of people living in the country. Prior to the Civil War, most of our population was in rural areas. There wasn't many giant cities. This era is where you see the really, really big growth of cities. And you can see here in the numbers, the population just starts growing exponentially. So we had almost 60 million people between 1870 and 1910. And then between 1910 and 1920, we add another 30 million. And most of this growth is coming from European immigration. Places like France, Italy, Ireland, Russia, your Eastern European countries, things like that. And so a lot of this population, again, is as people are moving from rural areas into urban areas, cities. New York went from 500,000 people to almost 3.5 million between 1865 and 1900. So New York really explodes in terms of population. And then Chicago only had about 29,000 people in 1850, so just before the Civil War. Chicago was a fairly small place, but then by 1910, it had more than 2 million people. So in those 60 years, it added 2 million citizens. So you really see this explosion of population, and that starts to get reflected in the literature and things like that. And so anytime you have large numbers of immigrants coming in, some people get anxious, some people resist it, some people don't want the new people coming in. And that happened in this era, as our population was booming, as we were getting a lot of immigrants from Europe and things like that. You had people who had been in America longer saying, we're full, we don't need any more. And so what you have here is you have this editorial cartoon of Uncle Sam, the representation there of America, basically returning immigrants, saying, we're full, we can't take any more. And you hear a similar argument today, but it's not a new argument. It's something that's been going on throughout our history. There's always been a group of people who say, we don't want that group of people. So that's something that starts to come to prominence in this era, and it also shapes the literature and starts to get reflected in the literature. So another really big idea of this era is the industrialization. We have manufacturing really kind of explodes in this era. The amount of money people start investing, as you can see, quadruples. You also have the rise of monopolies. So you have the rise of where single men control vast companies and vast fortunes. And what this starts to do is it creates a very wide kind of divide between the wealthy and the working poor, or the working class. And that starts to show up here, and that also kind of shapes the literature. And you have these immigrants and their children. Child labor was a big part of this era, who were providing the labor, but not necessarily getting ahead, not making a lot of money, while the men who control the monopolies are making just extravagant amounts of money. And so you really start to see kind of a class divide show up in this era, where you have your Rockefellers, your Vanderbilts, who are making just crazy amounts of money, while the immigrants and their workers and the children are not making a lot of money and not doing well and living in very poor conditions oftentimes. Along with the creation of these monopolies and this new super wealthy class, you had kind of the rise of really your first kind of gossip magazines. The wealthy were getting reported on. There were stories about their houses, their parties, things like that. And it started to show really kind of the contrast between the powerful and the working. So that started to show up in this era and started to be reflected in the literature. Part of this industrialization, and what you see here, is the creation of the assembly line. Henry Ford's kind of credited with this idea of the assembly line, and it allowed for things to be manufactured really quickly, but it also required a lot of human labor. No longer did you have one man taking a long time to make a thing. You had a bunch of people who did a very small part and then passed it down the line, so you needed to hire more workers. So there was some benefits in that it employed more people, but it also, like I talked about on the previous slide, helped kind of create those monopolies and that disparity between wealthy and poor. So what you see here on the left is a picture of Mulberry Street in New York City, kind of a fairly representative of an urban living environment, whether it was like New York or Chicago or something like that. And then on the right, you have Vanderbilt's mansion. So you have a very clear contrast here between your workers and your immigrants on this side versus your single man Vanderbilt and what he lives in. And that's where that really starts to explode kind of in this era. And all of this starts to play itself out in the literature. What's going on in the world always shapes what authors write. And so what you had in your post-Civil War literature is you had the rise of different character types. You started to see more of the common man character, people like industrial workers, the rural poor. You also started to see the business leaders, the people like your Rockefellers, your Vanderbilts. But you also saw more realistic characters, vagrants, prostitutes, unheroic soldiers, people that aren't necessarily noble. And so those kind of characters started showing up in the literature. And this era also started to create the idea of you could write as a career. It was no longer just kind of for enjoyment and because you really loved writing. You could start to actually make a living doing it. And that was kind of a new idea in America during this era. A lot of these authors that started to make livings doing this got their start with newspapers, reporting on events, Spanish-American War, things like that. People like Ambrose Bierce, who we're going to read, Jack London, Mark Twain, Kate Chopin, they all worked for newspapers and published things in magazines, and so they got their starts kind of as journalists and then branched off into their other writing. You also kind of had the rise of periodicals, giving the rise to the literature of argument. You started to see a rise in kind of editorials and things like that, calling for reform, calling for change, especially around the wealth divide, the class divide. And then a huge shape on American literature that came out of this era is the idea of the great American novel. It's a very almost cliched term now, but it was a new concept that got its start in this era. The idea that there's a distinct American style and that can be captured. And so that really came to prominence in this era. So the literature of this era looks a little different from what we've been reading. You have the rise of realism and naturalism. And so realism takes some various forms, and you had different thoughts around it. You have Howell's idea, and his idea of realism was journalism style, just the facts. I'm just going to give you the facts. I want to portray it as real as possible. Here's what happened. You make up your own mind. So that's one school of thought. James and Wharton, they focus more on the psychology. So they're still trying to be realistic, but they're looking at the emotional and moral dilemmas of especially upper-class characters. They wrote about almost exclusively upper class and about the moral and psychological dilemmas they faced. And then you have Twain, who also does realism, but he does it a little bit differently. He tries to capture the language the way it is. So this is where you have kind of the idea of colloquial showing up. And so Twain writes about some everyday people, and he tries to recreate their speech patterns, tries to make it sound like how they really talk. And so in this era, what we're going to read, you're going to start to notice is more real. It's more like people talk. It's a little less elevated language. They're not always trying to be very formal. And that's the idea of realism, which starts showing up and starts gaining popularity in this era. Along with realism, you have naturalism, which is similar but slightly different. So most of the naturalist writers feel like they're realist, but they're not the same as those we were talking about on the last slide. They felt like those guys were kind of prettying up what was going on. They weren't really being real in the naturalist mind. So your naturalist writers are writing about those characters on the fringe of society. They wrote about recognizable settings, so they're writing about the common man and they're setting their stories in maybe the slums or the city, something everyone can recognize. It's not a romantic notion. And a lot of times they're talking about characters who lack control. They're shaped by things that are out of their control, whether that's their genetics, whether that's their environment, whether it's random chance. That kind of stuff is shaping what happens to them. And in your naturalist stuff, there's rarely happy endings. It's a very kind of depressing view of what's going on. And there's, like I said, there's often bad luck and things like that. And so that's your naturalist. It's like realism, but in a naturalist eyes, they're more real. So you want to keep that in mind. They're similar, but slightly different. All right, so that wraps up the unit intro. Make sure you take the quiz over this, use your notes, and we'll see you in class tomorrow. If you're interested, Norton does have a website that goes into more depth and can help you with what we're going to be talking about in class. If you go to www.norton.com/studyspace, you'll be able to find some resources there. There's also a link on the right side of the blog there, so if you look for that and give that a look. Have a good night.